Welcome back to the program. The CEO of Budget, Seun Onigbinde, is still here on the show with me. Thank you so much, Seun, for sticking around. Of course, this is our last, lap on the program. But let's now take a look at the state governments and the markets. You mentioned it, in the conversation we had just before the break, talking about a lot of borrowings and the rest of it. Now, there are reports that there are some state governments that are heavily indebted to some commercial banks, and these are short-term loans. Is this sustainable?
It's not sustainable for most of them. And also, most of them have not hedged this against falling oil prices. Many people believe oil prices won't go beyond $80 per barrel. But we have seen oil prices trading less than $60 per barrel now. And with also the revenue you expect from that space, most of them have been saved by the devaluation of the price of the naira value. So it has also brought exchange rate gain. Like last FAC distribution, 55 billion naira was added to the amount that was shared from the exchange rate gain. Now that the markets, maybe the market are also showing appreciation of the naira, maybe possibly in the short time, and that might also be a worry. But it's clear that most state governments do this without clear knowledge of why you should borrow. And why you should borrow should be tied to a self-liquidating asset, meaning I borrow to build a market. And when I build that market, and by the rent, the tolls, and the fees I get from that market, it's able to pay back itself. Or you borrow to possibly build a stadium, you borrow to possibly build a facility that you know is not revenue generating, and that scale of paying back itself, it's not really helpful. For example, taxes are meant to solely be for the social infrastructure, and that's the way it's standard over. Taxes are meant to build your schools, your health clinics, and supposed to run the space of governance. And that's why when you look at Nigeria, our tax to GDP is less than 5%. An average economy in the world is 10 to 15%. So we are not doing enough. That's why we say we have a large economy. Most of the states have large economies. Because most of the markets are still informal and they are not taxing them. So, and this also comes with citizens nobody wants to pay tax. Citizens usually don't want to pay tax. But we need a lot more strengthening the institutions to ensure that we get these things out, because depending on oil, or this routine FAC allocation is unsustainable. Number one, the oil revenue is shrinking. The global dynamics around oil shows that prices will not rise, go high in the near term. So it's the time to even look in what's strong for them. And going ahead to borrow, you don't want to be in that state where you are so indebted that you can't even, and some of them can't pay salaries as are when due. I have people who are relations who work in government who say salaries now come a month after. Some, like in Osun, like 3 months or 4 months salaries are being owed. So that's a really trouble about that.
So now with the rising debt profile, with the rising need to borrow and the rest of it, let's take a look at some data from the Debt Management Office. As of last year, there were some states that actually had a high debt profile, including Lagos, Cross River, Kaduna, in fact. Now, how would this debt profile affect new administrations coming in at various state levels?
Yeah, sometimes debt is relative. So, for example, a Lagos state that owes a lot, you benchmark that against its IGR, and you say, yes, it's sustainable to a point, because debt has to be relative to the revenue. I'm not a fan of debt to the GDP, because you might have a huge GDP and your take from it is so minimal. But for state governments that are coming, it's a slippery appeal, because they must think through clearly how much is the charge, because most of these debts are first-line charges. For example, you get your money from CBN, you've taken a bond, the CBN would, before even remitting the balance to you, take its own charge.
Even FAC allocations, by the time
you get to the commercial bank, the commercial bank pulls its money.
Exactly.
So really, by the time you find states like Osun, would end of the day is entitled to close to 3.5 billion naira, mostly by monthly FAC allocation. But by the time you take in the commercial bank, you take in the CBN, the state government says it gets 1.1 billion naira, and it really clearly shows poor economic management at a certain level of funds. So I think the state government, everybody should be ready. Like I said, it takes a bold person to say he wants to be governor in this era, because you must have a sound economic management team who really is able to balance the citizens' interests, because citizens also want to see a rising scale in capital infrastructure. They want to see better roads, better pipeline water, better school. You've made a whole lot of promises, and you also have to think about how you're going to finance this sustainable. Some of them may begin to look outside in long-term loans, maybe 25-year loans, 30-year loans. You also be very careful what they are funding.
Exactly, because I was going to ask now, for some states that actually have the high debt profile, should they even still be considering, getting overseas borrowings? Because even though it's long term, you know, you still have to service that debt one way or the other.
Yep, you have to, even some of them might have to restructure current loans, maybe to just free up funds to be able. I think Osun has to do that at the point because the former governor took a loan from UBA, and it was a really, really serious debacle. I mean, Oyinlola, before the new governor came in, Aregbesola, he had to restructure and things like that. So sometimes you have to sit down and restructure. Can I pay? Can I spread it over a longer time period so that I can free more funds for myself to build infrastructure? Cross River, because of the Tinapa project, is part of the highest state that is indebted, and it also have to clean up. Sometimes we build projects and we also don't look at the environmental risk around it. Tinapa, a great idea of a project, but without a functional port that can berth ships, that can make that a truly free trade zone, did not finally work as it should work. And so you must do a strong risk analysis, not just for the fancy of it. Want to do a project that is nice and good. It's very, very important. So risk analysis for state government is very, very critical at this point. Yeah.
Especially since we're having a change of guard. Now, let's take a look at some of those projects. You talked about them, projects that can pay themselves, so to speak, and also pay the government. What options should the state, executive begin to focus on?
So the first focus you want is your own expenditure. Understand that this is an austere time, so cut your own waste. And make sure that you run government with a minimal levels of size, minimal size level, so that you don't walk and we see 40 cars in your convoy. People would never believe that there is no money. And that's the kind of impression you give to people when government leaves large, when the officials around them leave large. So you need to cut your expenditure. What you also need to look at your revenue collection structure. Are there opportunities for people for arbitrage or for corruption in those spaces? Would you automate all of them and make sure that you create a single window where people who want to pay can go ahead and pay? How do you look? Because most state government revenue also come from payee taxes from workers. So how are you also going to make sure that you are more firm in that space to ensure that more people pay those taxes and be based on where they reside, as the law says? Then you cannot look at the other major sectors in the economy. Which one are you going to open up? So in the next 2-3 years, you start seeing benefits, you start seeing gains. Are you going to bring in? I know it's always a fancy route, but most people say, oh, we're going to bring in investors from abroad. Then you bring in the investors, you give them a tax holiday of 5 years. At the end of the day, you don't take anything from it. So also you need to be very careful about waivers. All these tax holidays in the name of us driving and bringing foreign investment, because sometimes when you bring in foreign investors, you don't have control over their labor laws. We have weak labor laws. So you bring an investor who takes almost half of the entire personnel or the entire skilled personnel are also immigrants, and at the end of the day, you find that the state benefits too little in terms of taxes supposed to take on top of the people who are supposed to be employed. So there's a need for many critical thinking.
So in terms of, sorry, just to cut you there, in terms of critical thinking now, should the states, whichever administration comes in at that time, begin to focus on how they can, work with the indigenous investors, for instance, so that when the foreign investors eventually do come in, it's a more seamless merger for both parties.
Yeah, so you should look for the key spotlight. So for example, you expect one place for a state to take up technology and say, I'll be the hub of technology for the entire nation, building an amazing website, amazing application. So a state to say, okay, we want to be the hub of agriculture, and we look for investors who are going to pull into that space. We want to be the hub of mining. We want to be the hub of textile industry. We want to be the hub of something. So you take a critical industry, grow it to a certain level, put all the incentives on the table, especially for local investors, and gradually begin to ensure that you can take taxes off that to really truly run the economy. And in the process, you've created a social mobility structure where people can also get employed and move on to the ladder. So I think it's time to really think hard, but most of the time is make sure you cut your waste, efficiently taking your taxes, and make sure that most importantly, you look for a critical sector to open up and tax effectively.
On that note, I'd like to thank you, Seun, for coming on the program this morning.
Thank you so much.
It was an interesting conversation. And that's all we've got time for today on the show. If you missed today's episode or any other edition of the program, be sure to catch it on youtube.com/channelsweb/businessmorning. I'm Harriet Agbenyi. I'll see you soon.